Here in Nigeria, a constitutional amendment signed into law will allow Nigeria's 36 states to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity in regions covered by the national grid. President Muhammadu Buhari signed off on the bill, the fifth alteration bill number 33, devolution of powers. National grid system means the states can enter the electricity generation business. Presidential media spokesperson Tolu Ogunlesi confirmed that Buhari had signed 16 constitutional amendment bills into law. Here's a tweet from recently re-elected Governor of Lagos State, Babajide Sanwo-Olu, on the development, saying a few days ago, President Buhari signed the bills granting states more autonomy in key areas like electricity, railways, and the judiciary, empowering Lagos to take charge of our own growth. Says, thank you, Mr. President. And then right at the bottom says this will create a Lagos electricity market, leading to increased access to electricity investments and job opportunities. Joining us to discuss further, Oluwafemi Olaoye, Chief Operating Officer of Toset Industries, an engineer in so many fields, joining us to discuss. You're very welcome, Oluwafemi.
Thank you for having me.
So, good news. What do you make of what the president has signed?
Good news, better late than never.
Right as he's leaving office, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So we've been expecting this to happen quite some time ago, but it didn't come through, maybe because of the constitutional amendment process, legislative, all of that, then to the houses, to the respective states, and then back to the presidency and all of that. But yeah, it's a very good one for the electricity industry, for the energy industry and the electricity market in Nigeria. What I see happening is that what the federal government is not unable to do in terms of expanding the transmission infrastructure, it's now basically offloading some of that to the states. So states now have the capacity to build their own transmission infrastructure alongside what the federal government already has, because there are issues about Land Use Act, the federal government confiscating land to build a right of way for new transmission lines. All of that under the Siemens agreement, all those problems around that. So I think what I see the federal government doing here is giving, from the next dispensation, obviously, giving states the ability to generate their own power, transmit the same power, and also distribute that power as well.
So does this mean the TCN, the transmission company of Nigeria, will be unbundled?
No, so it doesn't mean that, because the transmission infrastructure that belongs to the federal government is still owned by the federal government. The federal government has not handed that over to states. But what the federal government has now said is that alongside where you have transmission infrastructure belonging to the national grid or to TCN, that you as a state can also build yours alongside that. So it gives the states the ability to now own their own TCN, so to say. So states can now develop their own TCNs and then run it alongside with what the federal government is doing. And this is actually the best practice around the world, because what we've seen around the world is that having such facilities run side by side gives flexibility. So in some instances where the national grid, where you have a brownout or even a blackout, so what that means, a brownout is when there's a partial blackout, when the transmission grid collapses, and there's a partial blackout in some areas and in some other areas. So where you have critical facilities, states can then come in now to support and provide power supply to those areas.
Okay, but if there were so many issues with TCN, so if in terms of its capacity, right, as far as wheeling capacity and so on, and then what the actual output was, if you're saying you can run alongside it, does it not, and it wasn't working in the first place, then does it not render it ineffective and then allow states to just go their own way?
Oh no, so it doesn't. Okay. Because first of all, the federal government has a lot of facilities across the country. They have facilities in almost in every state. And so the federal government has the ability to take power on its own in those facilities. Apart from that, you have regiments like the Air Force, the military, the Army, the Navy. All those regiments also require power. And most of them cannot really go to the states, as it were. They will need to obviously receive funding from the federal government before they can pay off their debt to states. So there can be sort of a balancing act between what the federal government is providing versus what the states is actually providing as well. So it doesn't necessarily render the federal government useless. Also, what it does is that if you have interstate transmission of power, in a case where, for instance, Lagos State is generating 3,000 megawatts and it has 500 megawatts in excess, Ogun State needs that 500 megawatts, it can jump on the national grid and send that over to Ogun State on an interstate level. So it's still the federal government's infrastructure or facility is still available within this framework. So I think it's actually a very good one.
Another big topic, cost-reflective tariffs, do the states now have the independence to charge their own tariffs? So where your Lagos, Ogun State example, Lagos will be charging X, Ogun is charging Y,
exactly.
other states and so on. So
exactly. So that's what actually excites me about what Governor Babajide Sanwo-Olu actually said, that they're working on a legislation to actually oversee the electricity market in Lagos State. So what that does is that in states where, for example, Lagos is a densely populated state, they can generate more income from the broader base that they have in Lagos State. So that means that you could also have, due to economies of scale, you could also have reduced tariff on that basis. Also, in the tariff system, there are multiple tariff systems that can be employed. You can have peak power, you can have time of use, you can also have static tariff systems. And what that does is, like, for instance, in the peak power situation, it's basically for industrial systems. So where you have excessive industrial load, you can set a particular amperage that can be drawn from the grid, so to say. And if you exceed that grid, you then pay a higher cost. So that gives you flexibility in terms of managing your tariff system. Another angle to that is that if Lagos State, for instance, implements a situation where you can have retail power generation, by that I mean households can have solar panels on their roofs and have an inverter system that actually allows them to backfeed some of that power during the day when there's excessive generation. They can backfeed some of that power to the grid and then offtake it at night when time of use is cheaper, or when time of use is actually in effect. What this allows is for people like yourself and myself to generate power and to reduce our tariff. In places where such a tariff system exists, there are people who have actually not paid a bill in multiple years, because they've just basically been offsetting give and take basically from the grid and from solar power generation.
Interesting.
States that have an advantage, such as Lagos State, for instance, will be able to do far more in terms of collecting tariff. And states that have that are less densely populated would also have their own mechanism by which they can generate a competitive advantage in terms of power generation, either for industrial use. Like, for instance, Ogun State has quite a lot of industries that are moving out of Lagos State.
Where are you guys? Are you guys?
Yeah, exactly. We're located in Ogun State. A lot of companies are moving towards that axis. A lot of manufacturing entities are moving towards that axis. So what we're going to see is the ability of states to generate generate income from tariff from their discos, respective local discos, through different avenues. Like I said, peak power is available, time of use is available, solar offsetting is available. So there are many mechanisms by which you can actually generate income via tariff.
What about the state of our infrastructure with respect to the assets themselves? That is the power assets themselves. Doesn't that factor in here, the quality of the assets with respect to the states being able to depend on them to generate the power that they need? So
yes, this actually comes into consideration because yes, we have quite an aging infrastructure. Although the federal government has tried to do a lot in terms of modernizing the infrastructure with the cement transformers that have been coming into the country. TCN has been taking multiple deliveries across the country of these transformers. So what this is trying to do is to modernize, so to say, as it were, the transmission infrastructure. But what we're now seeing with this legislation is that we're not going to have brand new infrastructure on the state level, and that also obviously would immediately add to the capacity that the transmission system has to be able to generate, distribute or transmit rather more of the electricity that is generated, because we have the capacity to generate about 12,500 megawatts, but we're only able to distribute about 5,500 at max distribution and transmission capacity. So with the states coming in now, what you will see is that there will be a massive addition to that transmission capacity. So we're probably going to have up to 10,000, maybe 15,000 within a short period of time if the states actually take it seriously and get on to do the work.
All right, and if you're just tuning in again, right before we went to Abia State, we were talking about President Buhari making a constitutional amendment allowing the states, 36 states, to be able to generate, transmit their own power. We're speaking with Engineer Olafemi Olaoye, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Tset Industries. What about the capacity of the states themselves? Like, okay, so we talk a lot about state police and the ability of the states to be able to, fiscally be able to pay salaries and so on and be able to manage their own state police. Can we make that argument for the power situation and then being able to, handle their own power? Do the states, from a fiscal perspective, many of which are owing salaries and have underwater with debts, would many of them have the capacity to be able to carry this out?
So earlier today, I was looking at the figures that you were reeling out about the states and the state of the states as published by budget, and we can clearly see that the states do not have the capacity to take on more debt. So what I foresee is a PPP situation where states get into private partnerships, public-private partnerships, to be able to deliver some of these gains that we see with this legislation. So what this does is to open up the sector, to open up the industry, to open up the space for private capital to come in, which obviously means that we'll have a lot of, you can see what the central bank has been doing with the cash reserve ratio, trying to pull as much money out of the system to ensure that inflation is kept low, which I do not, that's another topic. But with the funds being available in the banking sector, more companies can get onto the banking sector and get more of these funds out to be able to run some of these things, because we just have money sitting down idly doing nothing. I think that with some of these infrastructure investments available, more and more private players will come into the industry and will be able to invest more. Yeah,
we're just speaking of Abia State. Since Abia is collating its results, so we're just looking at some of the economic metrics of, do you think, so look at this. Their GDP, 3.5 trillion. Unemployment is 50%. Okay, let's stick to this now. Let me do this a practical example. And this ties into my next question for you. Abia State has the 3rd or 4th highest unemployment in the nation. And this is as of 2020. So that number could possibly be higher by now. My next question was to you about the level of poverty across the country. And I want to tie this to the cost-reflective tariffs for the states. Can many of the citizens of this country afford those cost-reflective tariffs if an Abia with 50% unemployment decides to jack up its tariffs to be competitive with neighboring southeastern states? How would that work? Can the citizens afford that?
So personally, I think yes, citizens can afford it. And let me say why. So in a time of use tariff situation, what that means is that during the day, when you have peak power generation or peak power consumption, usually by industrial players. So when the industry is drawing that a high amount of power from the system, a lot of people are at work. So during that period, you have a lower tariff. At night, when they come back from work between the hours of about 8 and 12 a.m., that's when you have peak power consumption in households. At that point, the power consumption is very minimal on the bill, on the total overall bill for that particular day. When they go to bed at 12 a.m., 1, 2 a.m., the tariff reduces because everybody's in bed, less power consumption. So the tariff reduces at that point and then comes back in the morning, back to the peak power for industrial use. So there are multiple strategies that can be employed in this situation to manage the tariff, as it were, to manage power consumption as well, so that people can better plan how they use their power, how they utilize their power. Don't put on your washing machine or to run all day while you're at work. You can put it on at night when the tariff is lower, or don't put on your light bulb and just go off to work. You can have to, switch off some light bulbs here and there to manage, because usually we're always talking about generation, transmission, distribution, but we don't usually talk about the 4th realm, which is actually energy conservation. Energy conservation is a very big deal across the world, in as little as just how you conserve energy within your house, how you energy proof your house, how you insulate your house from the environment. As little as those things are, they actually go a long way in managing our electrical infrastructure.
I also want to ask you about, okay, we have to go back to Abia, but look, Engineer Femi Olaoye, COO, Toasted Industries, which of course you guys generating your own power in Ogun State, so you're an expert on this field. Thanks for joining.